Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise tonight at adjournment proceedings, or actually I should say I rise early this morning on adjournment proceedings, to pursue a question I raised in the House with the Honourable Minister of Foreign Affairs. I actually put the question to the Prime Minister initially, but it was on March 6th of this year. Now, this pertains to an issue that couldn't be more timely, and that's why, Mr. Speaker, I accepted the opportunity to debate on the matter after 1 a.m. This morning, rather than risk not being able to put the question to the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary for a response. The issue that I raised March 6th is the Treaty on Conventional Arms. It's the Arms Trade Treaty, and when I raised the issue, March 18th still was ahead of us, and the United Nations was going to be debating this critical treaty. As I stated in my question to the Honourable Minister, that I was grateful for the fact that Canada was overall supportive of the treaty, but it did seem strange that we had decided not to support the important criterion that if corruption was at stake, that should be one of the measurements of whether an arms deal should be approved under the treaty. And I also, of course, wanted to have the assurance of the Prime Minister that Canada was supporting all elements of the treaty. This treaty did go to successful conclusion in negotiations in the special session of the United Nations that began on March 18th. There's a great deal of celebrating around the world for that, and Canada did vote for the treaty. But the news reports that came out of New York following the treaty's acceptance suggest that Canada's support was somewhat lukewarm. There have been efforts to find out whether Canada plans to sign on as an early ratifier so that we can actually be part of getting this treaty operationalized globally. Spokesmen from the Office of the Minister of Foreign Affairs have been somewhat equivocal about whether Canada will join on soon. Now, I put that in contrast with Norway and New Zealand and Japan, countries that have said yes when the treaty is open for signatures, which happens, Mr. Speaker, as early as this coming Monday, June 2nd, they will sign on. So we will see countries signing on, and as soon as 50 countries have ratified, the Arms Trade Treaty will take effect. Let me just review what this treaty will do. Will create common international standards for the regulation of the international trade in conventional arms, ammunition, parts, and components. It applies to tanks, it applies to all manner of munitions, and it is something that will help make the world safer. We have been troubled by the fact that the non-government organizations allowed on the Canadian delegation were limited to groups that support the use of private long guns, and that's perfectly appropriate within Canada, but it's a mismatch when you're looking at a global treaty to protect nations around the world from the damage done by a conventional arms trade. So, Mr. Speaker, I look forward to words from my Parliamentary Secretary, my friend. I'm hoping that he will confirm that Canada has decided to be an early adapter, a country that will ratify along with Norway, New Zealand, and Japan at our earliest opportunity when the treaty opens for signature on June 3rd, would certainly be welcome news for Canadians who yearn for us to return to our traditional role of leadership in peacekeeping and of making the world a safer place. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Foreign Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the Honourable Member that she raised this question even this late at night, Mr. Speaker. Canada already has some of the highest standards for the export of conventional arms. The items included in the ATT are already subject to export controls in Canada. Furthermore, Canada already applies the criteria set out in the ATT when considering an arms export. Despite the high standards set by Canada, the international trade in conventional arms remain poorly controlled in many parts of the world. Providing arms to insurgents, terrorists, transnational criminal groups, and rogue regimes undermine international security and trade interests. It is for this reason that Canada participated in the negotiations on the Arms Trade Treaty that would help curtail illicit and irresponsible arms transfers. Our Conservative government supports the rights of legitimate law-abiding gun owners, and to that end, we eliminated the unfair burden of the wasteful and ineffective long gun registry. It was and remains very important to Canada that an ATT not hinder the legal and responsible international trade in conventional arms or create new burdens for Canadian industries or firearm owners, and we played a key role in ensuring that ATT acknowledges the lawful ownership of our firearms by responsible private citizens. The government supported the inclusion of the anti-corruption language in the ATT. In fact, Canada already considers corrupt practices when looking at the risk of diversion associated with the proposed export. This is consistent with the government's anti-corruption efforts in domestic and international spheres, including our work within the G20 and the United Nations. Mr. Speaker, Canada worked closely with our friends and allies in an attempt to negotiate an instrument that would help keep weapons out of the hands of the criminals, terrorists, and human rights abusers, while at the same time recognizing and protecting the ability of the law-abiding private firearm owners to enjoy the recreational use of their firearms in a responsible manner. The government is now consulting all interested stakeholders on the ATT in order to gain their insight and analysis. The views of all interested parties in Canada will serve to better inform the government as we decide our next step. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm very grateful to the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary for staying and that he would express gratitude that I raised the issue at this late hour. I do still have concerns because in part of his remarks he seemed to, as others have done in his government, conflate the issue of domestic use of firearms with this treaty. And I think we need to underscore this so that no one is confused about it. This treaty has nothing to do with domestic use of firearms. It has nothing to do with any kind of civilian ownership or domestic trade in firearms. It is specifically about ensuring effective regulation of international transfers of conventional weapons. And as I said before, Mr. Speaker, it applies to a range of military apparatus, including tanks, armored combat vehicles, large caliber artillery systems, combat aircraft, attack helicopters, warships, missiles and missile launchers, and small arms and light weapons. You know, we hear the stories of child soldiers, Mr. Speaker, and we know that those munitions and the forced conscription of children into war zones is an appalling and immoral act. If we can control the international trade in these munitions, guns, and armaments, we can protect those children and we can reduce conventional conflict in hot spots around the world. I urge the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary and his government to ratify the treaty June 3rd.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, I can understand the concern that the honourable member has expressed in reference to the export of arms internationally. And that, Mr. Speaker, is we have one of the highest standards for export of conventional arms, Mr. Speaker. But that does not, when we are signing convention, it is important to ensure that the conventions that we are signing internationally do not overspill into the domestic legislation that is currently in Canada. For that reason, we are in consultation with stakeholders, and as we do with that, Mr. Speaker, Canada has every intention to sign and control the export of arms, Mr. Speaker, to rogue regimes, and as she has mentioned as well. So she can rest be assured that we will be working with stakeholders, but our goal is in the end to sign this treaty as well, but to ensure it doesn't spill over into the domestic laws of this country. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.